Can you forgive a villain you grew up hating? For 60 years, one character has represented the worst thing Spider-Man's world could produce. Not a monster from space, not a god gone wrong, just a man, brilliant, broken, and without mercy. His name meant something. It meant this is the one Peter Parker cannot fully survive. Marvel turned the worst villain in Spider-Man's history into a hero. And he's been one for 6 years now, and I'm still not sure if I fully trust him. I asked a group of comic readers one question. Can you forgive Norman Osborn, or what makes him irredeemable? Like, what could he do in your eyes to be redeemable? And one of my friends answered, nothing. Probably not, it would take a lot, maybe someday, just no, nothing. Full stop. No conditions, no path forward, nothing. And I've been sitting with that answer ever since because Marvel has spent the last 6 years trying to prove him wrong. They gave Norman Osborn a gold suit, his own comic series, and a supernatural cleansing of every sin he's ever committed. They've had him fight alongside Spider-Man, mentor him, and now, as of 2025, wear his costume. 6 years, and my friend still said nothing. So here's the question I want to spend this whole video on. Can you actually forgive a villain you grew up hating? And what does it mean when the answer might be, no matter what the story does, that some villains get so deep into you that forgiveness becomes impossible? Because I don't think it's as simple as it sounds. I don't think the answer is the same for everyone. And here's what I didn't expect to find when I started digging into this. The answer has almost nothing to do with Norman Osborn, and it has everything to do with us. Let's establish what we're working with here, because the weight of this question only lands if you feel what these characters actually did. Norman Osborn is the Green Goblin. By all accounts, Spider-Man's greatest villain, not because he has the best powers or the most elaborate schemes, but because he caused the most damage to Peter Parker as a person. He killed Gwen Stacy. He threw the woman Peter loved off a bridge, and when Peter's web caught her, she was already gone. The whiplash from the sudden stop had killed her before she ever reached his arms. He let Peter believe for a split second that he'd saved her. Her body told him the truth. Amazing Spider-Man number 121 from 1973. That issue changed what superhero comics were allowed to be. And that's just the headline. Norman spent decades manipulating people. And that's just the headline. Norman spent decades manipulating Peter psychologically. He had Peter and MJ's newborn daughter kidnapped at the hospital through his agent, a wound that was never healed before one more day erased that entire chapter of Peter's life from continuity. That baby existed, that harm was real, and it was never made right. He ran a shadow government during Dark Reign. He weaponized Peter's identity, his family, his grief, over and over again across 60 years of publishing history. He's not just a villain, he is a generational wound in Spider-Man's story. Now think about Jonah Jameson. This guy never threw a punch, but he might have done more consistent damage over more years than anyone else. He used this newspaper, the Daily Bugle, his platform, to run a decades-long smear campaign against Spider-Man. He funded the creation of actual supervillains, including the Scorpion, specifically to destroy him. And he did all of it while Peter Parker, who desperately needed that money, was selling him the photographs he used as weapons. JJJ was, for most of Spider-Man's history, a villain without a costume. These are the two characters Marvel has spent years turning into Peter's allies. And here's the thing. One of them worked on me completely, full conversion. I went from hating this man to actively rooting for him. And somehow, in that process, I realized this isn't really a question about Norman Osborn at all. It's a question about whether you're capable of changing your mind about someone who hurt you. That's a much harder question, and I don't think most of us have honestly asked it. I'm going to tell you exactly how that happened, because the mechanics of how it worked on me are also the reason why Norman is so much harder. And once you see the difference, the whole question changes. And let me tell you the truth about Jonah Jameson first, because he's the proof of concept. He's the evidence that this can actually work. Around 2017, in Peter Parker the Spectacular Spider-Man, Peter did something remarkable. He revealed his identity to Jonah, not as a power move, not to win an argument, as an act of compassion towards a man who was falling apart, who had lost almost everything and who had no one left. In Amazing Spider-Man number 800, the next year in 2018, Peter looked Jonah in the eye and told him he forgave him for everything. That was almost 8 years ago, as of the time of this recording. 8 years of JJJ being Spider-Man's loudest public defender. 8 years of him writing pro Spider-Man editorials with the same furious, relentless energy he once used to destroy him. Marvel didn't reverse it after 2 issues. They didn't walk it back when sales dipped. They committed to it. 8 years. Multiple writers, multiple creative teams, all of them honoring the same character shift. That's how comics canonize a change. Not one writer's run, but sustained agreement across the whole publishing apparatus. And it worked on me. I want to be completely clear about that. I genuinely, unironically love JJJ now. The man I spent decades resenting every time he appeared on the page has become one of my favorite parts of reading Spider-Man. The redemption arc landed. I'm a convert. But I want to be honest, it wasn't immediate. I didn't read Amazing Spider-Man number 800 and feel the walls coming down and in that moment. It happened slowly without me even noticing. Accumulated time, Marvel not flinching, year after year of JJJ showing up as an ally and meaning it. And somewhere in there, my feelings changed. I didn't see that coming. The same thing happened with Norman. Not all at once, not because of one specific issue or one specific moment. Just one day I was reading Amazing Spider-Man and I stopped and I said, wait, this is really happening, and I trust him now. I don't know exactly when it happened, it just happened. The same slow accumulation that worked on JJJ had worked on Norman too. And I need to be honest about why, because understanding why I got there is the whole argument. Jonah's transformation was human. He didn't get his sins magically extracted. He had a breakdown. He was confronted with the full weight of what his obsession had cost him and the people around him. And he chose imperfectly, painfully, in a very JJJ way to be something different. That process is recognizable. We've seen people do that in real life. We know what it looks like. We know what it costs. And we know somewhere in us how to forgive. Norman's mechanism is different. And here's the thing. It's the reason I actually got there with him. The supernatural removal of his sins. The Sin Eater literally extracted the evil from his soul in 2020. And when I read that, my honest reaction was, okay, I can work with that. Because if those sins were actually causing him to be evil, if it wasn't fully him, it was the corruption of the goblin formula operating inside him, then it functions almost like the insanity plea. I can't fully blame someone for actions their mind was compromised into committing. Once those sins were gone, what I saw was a man who genuinely wanted to be good, who became a good friend to Peter Parker. And Peter Parker is my all-time favorite comic book character. So watching Norman be a real friend to him, protecting him, supporting him, choosing him, it got to me. All those years of stress Peter was put through at Norman's hands felt like they amounted to something, like there was a light at the end of a very long tunnel. And I know how that sounds to a lifelong reader. I know exactly what that is because I've been that reader. I am that reader right now. But I'm also an experienced enough comics reader to know the illusion of the third act. Those characters don't get endings. There is no light at the end of the tunnel, not really. The tunnel just keeps going. So even as I was feeling that warmth, even as I was trusting Norman, there were two voices in the back of my head that wouldn't go quiet. The first, hey, he killed people that Peter loved. Gwen Stacy is still dead. That baby is still unaccounted for. And I'm not even going to go into the whole sins past thing with him and Gwen. I'm not even going to touch that with a 10-foot pole. Those aren't abstract sins. Those were specific people. The second voice in my head was the one I've learned from about 60 years of reading superhero comics. Marvel will reverse this. They always do. And when they do, when Norman goes back to being the Goblin, what will all of this have meant? What will my trust have been worth? And I still can't fully 100% get there. I would say I'm like 90% right now, but that 100%, I can't rule out that chance in the back of my mind. Here's why. When the mechanism of redemption is a supernatural cleanse, it starts to function less like a character arc and more like an insanity plea. Like I said, we don't hold people fully accountable for actions taken while their minds are compromised by an outside force. The Goblin formula warped Norman, okay, but Norman chose to take that formula. And Gwen Stacy, again, is still dead. Peter and MJ's baby was still kidnapped on Norman's orders. And that story was never resolved. It got swallowed by one more day and has never been made right. The ledger doesn't clear because his soul got laundered. The accountability isn't there. And without accountability, who are we actually forgiving? Is it Norman, or is it a new person who simply carries Norman's memories? Here's the thing that puts it in sharpest focus. Think about what the mask means for both of these characters. Peter Parker puts on a mask to take on more responsibility than anyone would ask of him. Norman Osborn put on a mask to avoid taking any. The Goblin wasn't a transformation, it was a permission slip, a system of committing evil without having to own it. And now Marvel wants us to believe that system is gone, that the man who built his entire villain identity around the avoidance of accountability has somehow found it? That's the specific thing that I just can't get past. Not the evil acts themselves, the architecture of the man who committed them. One of the people I texted this week put it more specifically than I could. He said, I can't forgive Norman until he returns Peter and MJ's child. That's not an abstract moral demand. That's a specific thing, a concrete, costly action taken in the direction of the person you hurt most. That's what real accountability looks like. Not losing your guilt, losing something that actually matters to you in service of someone you wronged. But here's where it gets even more philosophically complicated, because another friend pushed back in a different way that I didn't expect. They said, okay, sure, his sins were removed, but that doesn't mean he isn't capable of committing new ones. He still has free will. He could still choose to do evil tomorrow. And then he asked me a question that I haven't been able to shake ever since. So he's forced to be good? Think about what that actually means. If the supernatural cleansing removed not just Norman's sins, but his capability for evil, if he literally cannot choose darkness anymore, then his heroism isn't a choice, it's a condition. And redemption that isn't a choice isn't really redemption, it's just neutralization. There's a profound difference between a villain who becomes good and a villain who gets defanged. One requires courage, will, and cost. The other just requires a procedure. Now, if his capacity for evil wasn't removed and he's genuinely choosing good every day with full ability to choose otherwise, that's actually the most compelling argument in his favor. That choice would be real. That choice would mean something. The Goblin did come back briefly, and here's the detail that matters, that most people miss when they talk about this. In Amazing Spider-Man number 35, Peter had been infected with Norman's past sins, and he turned into a villain. Norman then freed him. But the cost was that Norman's sins came back home to him. He chose to take them back to save Peter. He literally absorbed the evil back into himself so that Peter didn't have to carry it. And by Amazing Spider-Man number 50, the Goblin persona reemerged as a result. Honestly, even knowing that, my gut reaction was exactly what the skeptics predicted. See, he reverted. I knew it. The story admitted he couldn't hold it. But that's not where the story ended. In Amazing Spider-Man number 54, the Goblin tried to leave Norman entirely and possess Peter instead. And Norman helped Peter destroy it permanently. The Goblin, as a separate entity, as a psychological force that had defined Norman Osborn for 60 years, is dead, gone. Norman helped kill the thing he'd been for most of his life. That's not a stumble. That's arguably the most redemptive thing Norman has ever done. He didn't just resist the Goblin, he helped erase it. And I still, in the back of my mind, can't fully trust him. What more must this man do? And that's the question that cracks something open for me. Because if Norman helping permanently destroy the Goblin isn't enough, if that doesn't move the needle, then I have to ask myself whether anything ever could. And the honest answer is, I'm not sure. And I think that's more about my conditioning than it is about his actions. I grew up with Norman Osborn is the bad guy. Green Goblin is the Joker to Peter Parker's Spider-Man. He's just always going to be this force of evil, and everything has reinforced it. Movies, animated shows, video games, all forms of storytelling. Even if you look at, my son is watching Spidey and His Amazing Friends on Disney Plus, and that show, Gobby is the bad guy. He's a bad boy. And so the Green Goblin has always just been this force of evil, no matter what. And then Marvel did something I genuinely did not see coming. In April of 2026, as I'm recording this video right now, a new miniseries called Spider-Versity launches. And in it, Norman Osborn is training the next generation of spider heroes. Miles Morales, Spider-Gwen, Silk, the young ones, the younglings. He's mentoring them. And here's the detail that stopped me cold when I read it. He's training them to defeat the next great threat to the spider family. And that threat is the Green Goblin. Norman Osborn is literally preparing a generation of young heroes for the day when he himself goes bad again. He's planning for his own failure. He is putting the tools to defeat himself in the hands of the people who need them most. I don't know what to do with that. I genuinely don't. But I know it's the most honest, costly, accountable thing he has ever done. And I still don't fully trust him, which means either my bar is impossibly high or he hasn't hit it yet. I mean, think about Doc Ock. Dr. Octopus didn't just turn good in a one-shot. Marvel gave him 3 full ongoing series across a decade. The original Superior Spider-Man in 2013, where he literally took over Peter's body and wore the Spider-Man costume for 33 issues. Then brought him back as Superior Spider-Man again in 2018, and then again in 2023 for the 10th anniversary. 3 separate heroic runs. And as of this month, as I'm recording this, Doc is the main villain in Marvel's biggest crossover event of the year, Superman Spider-Man. 3 series as a hero. But then this mainstream idea of Dr. Octopus is he's always going to be a bad guy. Same thing with Norman. He's back to the monster. That oscillation is the precedent that makes Norman skeptics say, even if it's real right now, Marvel will find a way back to the Goblin, because that's what they do. One person that responded to my earlier question said to me, I'd forgive him, but I don't know that I'd ever trust him. And that stopped me cold, because I've been treating those as the same thing this whole time, and they absolutely are not. Forgiveness is something you do for yourself. It's releasing someone from the debt of their past, saying, I'm not going to let what you did define how I carry you anymore. You can forgive someone completely and still never hand them the keys to your house. Forgiveness is about the past. It's about you. Trust is something you extend towards someone's future. It's a bet on who they're going to be. And trust has to be earned incrementally through demonstrated behavior over time without wobbling. The reason that J. Jonah Jameson worked on me is that Marvel earned both. 8 years of consistent behavior across multiple writers and creative teams built trust first. The forgiveness followed from that. That's the order that it has to go into. One of my friends gave me the most specific answer that I could have gotten from anyone. He said he'd need 10 to 15 years in real time to believe Norman isn't evil, with multiple writers consistently keeping him present and consistently good-natured. Not one run, not one creative vision, multiple different writers over more than a decade, all choosing to keep him heroic. That's the bar. And honestly, that's exactly what happened with JJJ. It wasn't just Dan Slott or just Chip Zdarsky or just Nick Spencer. It was all of them passing the baton to each other, keeping JJJ as an ally across different eras of the book. That institutional commitment is what made it feel real. Norman is 6 years in under a smaller number of writers. By the math, he might just need a little bit more runway. But here's where it gets darker, because another reader made an argument that genuinely shook me. They said Norman is more untrustworthy than Lex Luthor. Not more dangerous, more untrustworthy. Their reasoning was Lex Luthor has always had altruistic motivations underneath everything that he does. Even when his methods are twisted, there's a documented history of real moral complexity in Lex that predates any official redemption arc. You always understand what Lex is doing, even when you hate it. Norman has almost never shown that kind of internal complexity, except in these last 6 years. So they might just be letting the character evolve. And we've seen that with a number of different villains over the years, from just being the mustache twirling black and white to a more morally gray. And because Norman plays the long game better than almost any villain in comics history, every good act becomes potentially suspect. Every heroic moment becomes potential setup. Think about what that actually means. If you've read enough Spider-Man, you've been trained by the character himself to suspect Norman's kindness. Norman has used goodwill as a weapon before. He's a planner. He's patient. He's played decades-long cons. So when he shows up as a genuine hero, your brain, if it's been shaped by 60 years of Norman Osborn being Norman Osborn, doesn't read that as redemption. It reads it as the longest setup in comics history. That's not skepticism anymore. That's a villain so deeply embedded in your psychology that you've made him immune to redemption by definition. Every good act proves nothing. Every good act is just more evidence of how patient he's being. And I have to ask myself, is that wisdom Or is that a trap that I've built into my own head that no story could ever get me out of? Here's my actual take on all this. I know this is going to land wrong for some of you. If Marvel fully commits to Norman as a permanent hero, and I mean holds the line for a decade, the way they did with JJJ across multiple writers without blinking, it will be the most interesting thing they've done with Spider Man in a generation. The tension would be extraordinary. A redeemed Green Goblin would force every future Spider Man story to reckon with the question of what Peter Parker's greatest wound actually means. I'm thinking about, like, in Dragon Ball Z, how Goku makes everybody that he beats into his best friend. But I don't think Marvel's going to do that. I think Norman will be Green Goblin again within 5 years, not because the story demands it, because Marvel always flinches when the stakes are this high. When that happens, and I'm saying when, not if, it won't just be a plot reversal, it'll be proof that Marvel doesn't actually believe their most important characters can permanently change. And that failure of nerve will cost this story everything it's been building towards. DC let Batman be Batman for 80 years. They let Dick Grayson transform from Robin into Nightwing. They let him evolve. Marvel should be brave enough to just let Norman Osborn be something new. When I started reading Spider-Man comics in the 1990s, I didn't know the backstory. I didn't know the full history of most of the characters I was reading. I didn't know what they'd been through in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. I just knew them as they were when I arrived. And here's the thing. I never felt like I was missing anything. To me, it was just who those characters were. The version I encountered first became my baseline, my anchor. Whatever was true when I showed up felt like how it had always been, because for me, it had always been that way. There's a name for this in psychology. It's called anchoring bias. Your first exposure to something becomes the reference point that everything else gets measured against. In fandom, people sometimes call it my first syndrome. The version of a character you encounter first feels like the real one, and every subsequent version gets judged against the original anchor. Now think about what that means for the Norman Osborn conversation. If you've been reading Spider-Man comics for 6 years or less, you have never seen Norman Osborn as the villain in the comics. You've only ever seen him as an ally, as a mentor, as the guy in the gold suit trying to make things right. You don't have a villain anchor. You don't need to forgive him because there's nothing to forgive. The question, can you forgive Norman Osborn, doesn't even make sense to you. It's like asking you to forgive someone for something you've never witnessed. That's a completely different psychological relationship with the same character. And it's not wrong, it's just a different entry point. And it's not just Norman and J. Jonah Jameson. Think about Peter and MJ. Marvel broke them up genuinely, sustainably, with One More Day. And the fans were furious. That was supposed to be temporary, a reset, something that would get fixed within a year or two. And I genuinely never thought it would stick. I assumed the way all comic fans, we all assumed comic changes are temporary. Peter and MJ would be back together within a few years. That was nearly 20 years ago. Marvel has held the line, and most of us have quietly made peace with it, even if we'd never admit it out loud. That pattern keeps repeating. We grow attached to the way things are. We assume the status quo will revert itself, and there are plenty of times where we don't even notice the change has stuck until we look back a decade later and realize, wait, it's been 10 years of this. This is just how things are now. And one of my friends put it like this, because the status is not quo. He's right. Longtime readers aren't more right about Norman. We're just more stuck. The anchor is heavier. The baseline is harder to move. And the more history you carry with a character, the more work it takes for a story to shift how you feel about them. The only constant in life and in comics is change, and the readers who resist it longest are the ones who loved the original version the most. Now I want to bring in one outside comparison, just one, that I think puts a sharp point on everything we've been talking about. Kylo Ren. Kylo Ren got a redemption arc. Ben Solo came back. Audiences had extremely mixed feelings, and a lot of that criticism was completely legitimate. But here's what gets constantly lost in that conversation. Kylo Ren died for his redemption. The story made him pay a price with his life, and people still argued about whether it was enough. Norman Osborn is alive. He's wearing the Spider-Man costume. The difference between an audience accepting a villain's redemption and rejecting it almost always comes down to one thing: cost. What did this character give up to become something better? Kylo lost everything. Norman lost his guilt, and then helped destroy the thing his guilt came from. That's more than nothing, but it's still not the same as dying for it. And here's the crucial difference that makes Norman harder than Kylo. Audiences lived with Kylo Ren's villainy for like 4 years across 3 films. We have been living with the Green Goblin for 60 years. That's not the same emotional debt. That's a completely different scale of history to overcome. A 4-year villain who dies for redemption still sparks debate. A 60-year villain who gets a supernatural cleanse, a new suit, briefly reverts, helps permanently kill the goblin, and then puts on the Spider-Man costume. That's a story with more chapters still to write. The cost has to match the debt. But here's what makes it even more complicated. Most of the people forming opinions about Norman Osborn right now have never read a single issue of The Amazing Spider-Man. But here's the layer that makes this whole question genuinely unfair, and I mean that in the most interesting way possible. Everything I've been talking about, the anchoring bias, the trust gap, the long game, that's all about comic readers, and comic readers are a tiny fraction of the people who have feelings about Norman Osborn. Because most people on this planet don't know any of this. They don't know about the Gold Goblin. They don't know the thing about JJJ writing Spider-Man editorials. They don't know about the Sin Eater arc. They know J.K. Simmons screaming about Spider-Man across 3 different film universes and video games and animated shows. That's the JJJ that lives in the cultural imagination for most people on this planet. They have no idea he's been Peter Parker's most vocal defender in the comics for almost 8 years. They know Willem Dafoe in a Power Rangers mask. They know the version of the Green Goblin that killed Gwen Stacy in The Amazing Spider-Man 2. That's who lives in the cultural imagination. The Gold Goblin doesn't exist to most people on the planet. So think about what that means for someone like me, a longtime reader who's genuinely trying to update my relationship with these characters. I'm not just fighting my own history with them, I'm fighting the entire cultural current. Every new Spider-Man movie, every Marvel game, every new fan who comes to the franchise, they meet the Goblin, the monster. Pop culture keeps handing everyone around me reasons to feel the way I've always felt, even as I'm trying to feel differently. I texted my wife about Norman Osborn. She's not a deep comics reader. She knows these characters from movies, from cultural osmosis, from sitting next to me on the couch. And without hesitating, she said, "No, I hate him. Same as my earlier friend. Same zero conditions, same closed door." She's never read a single issue of Amazing Spider-Man. She just knows what Willem Dafoe taught her, and that answer from someone with zero comics history is identical to the answer from someone with 60 years of it. That's how deep the pop culture current runs. But here's where something genuinely new just happened. In January of 2025, Marvel released an animated series called Your Friendly Neighborhood Spider-Man on Disney+. And in that show, Norman Osborn, voiced by Coleman Domingo, is Peter Parker's mentor, not his enemy, his mentor, the Tony Stark of this version of the story. An entirely new generation of kids is being introduced to Norman Osborn as a good guy from the very first episode they ever watch. They will never have this villain anchor. They will never need to forgive him. To them, this is just who he is. That generational split I've been describing between readers who grew up hating Norman and the new readers who only know him as an ally, it's not just happening in comics anymore. It's happening in living rooms right now. And in 20 years, when someone tries to bring back the Green Goblin, it's those kids who won't be able to get there. Because for them, that's not who Norman Osborn is. And season 2 is bringing in Gwen Stacy as Spider-Gwen, which means a new generation is about to watch Norman Osborn build a relationship with the girl he's eventually going to kill. They just don't know it yet. The only constant in comics is change, and the readers who arrive after the change don't know it was ever different. Which brings me to where I actually land on all of this, and I want to be honest with you, it surprised me. JJJ worked on me, and Norman worked on me the same way. That's the honest answer, the slow manipulation, the slow accumulation, the same patience from Marvel, the same experience of one day going, whoa, I trust him now. I don't know exactly when it happened, it just had. And then I sat with that for a minute, and 2 thoughts came up that I can't fully quiet. The first, he killed people that Peter loved. Gwen Stacy, Peter and MJ's baby, who was kidnapped on his orders, never accounted for. Those aren't abstract sins. Those are specific people who are gone or unaccounted for because of Norman Osborn. The supernatural removal of his sins makes it easier for me to extend forgiveness. It functions like the insanity plea, and I can work with that, but it doesn't bring those people back. The second, Marvel will reverse this. They always do. And this is the thing that comics have trained me to know after decades of reading. Death loses meaning when it gets reversed enough times. Character turns lose meaning when they get reversed enough times. And when Norman goes back to being the Goblin, not if, when, all of this trust I've built up will feel like it was spent on nothing. The same way Kylo Ren dying for his redemption still felt hollow to some people because the franchise itself felt untrustworthy. The story inside the story matters, but so does the story of how the story gets told. So here's where I actually am. I trust Norman Osborn in 2026. Marvel got me there. I didn't see it coming, and then one day it happened. And I'm holding that trust with both hands while a voice in the back of my head says, enjoy it while it lasts, because the only constant in comics is change. And we don't get to choose which direction it goes. You came into this video asking whether Norman Osborn deserves forgiveness, but that was never the right question. The right question is whether you already have. Because that's what happened to me. I didn't decide to trust Norman Osborn. I didn't sit down one day and reason my way into it. I just looked up from the page one afternoon and realized it had already happened. The same way it happened with JJJ. The same way the Peter and MJ separation I swore would never stick has now been true for nearly 20 years. Marvel changed me without asking my permission, and I didn't notice until it was done. So the question was never about Norman. It was always about whether a story, patient enough, honest enough, consistent enough, could change you without even knowing it was trying. And if it can do that with Norman Osborn, imagine what it could do with you.